Hey friends, welcome back to my channel. I'm really excited today. I have an amazing guest, Dr. Nicole DiNezza, the gut microbiome queen on YouTube and Instagram. Dr. Nicole and I have been longtime colleagues, and it's been so awesome to speak with you on the IBS Freedom podcast. Her podcast is called IBS Freedom, and our approach really resonates because we talk a lot about root cause investigation and, a holistic view of digestive health. And so, Dr. Nikki, do you want to tell people kind of a little bit about your background and who you are, what you do?
Yeah, that's a loaded question, I suppose. But yeah, I think I like the way that you started us off by saying that our kind of treatment methodologies line up really well because we're really holistic. And that doesn't necessarily mean taking like a supplement for this, an herb for this, a supplement for this, an herb for this. It's again, really trying to get at the root of what's going on with the person, and holistic in the sense of like lifestyle medicine, nutritional counseling, and maybe some herbs and supplements if needed. But that's not a really dominant part of what either of us do, I think. At least that's what I've gotten from you over the years, talking to you and interviewing you on the podcast. I've kind of gone the whole gamut though. I can poke fun at that world because I was fully entrenched in that world for a good long while, both as a patient and as a clinician. So to be quite honest with you, I got into functional medicine initially because I found it very enchanting that we could test for everything. Right? Like, ooh, we could really tease apart all of this biochemistry and all of the stuff. We could know everything. There was some like nerd part of me that really thought that was cool and sexy. And so I got into functional medicine with this idea that we could test, not guess, and we could know exactly what's going on with the person. And then we just target that with our nutraceuticals. And I kind of went through that as a patient myself when I had tummy problems. And I say tummy problems more broadly because I never received the official diagnosis of SIBO, but looking back at my symptoms and what I dealt with and kind of the patterning over time, I bet that if I knew what SIBO was and I knew enough to get a SIBO test, I probably would have received a positive diagnosis. So I think that I'm very much somebody who's recovered from SIBO, even though I didn't have the official label at the time. Because like nobody was talking about SIBO in 2010. Just totally. That wasn't really a thing. So, but I kind of chased my tail for a couple of years there because at the time, the sexy diagnosis, the big thing was leaky gut. Everybody and their brother was talking about leaky gut. So I was convinced I just had the world's worst case of leaky gut. That's all there is to it. And I swilled the stuff called Repairvite day in, day out. And I did this on again, off again, and elimination diets left and right for 2 or 3 years. And I spun my wheels for a really long time. And it wasn't until a couple of aha moments for me, both of which had to do with stress. So one, I moved out of a living situation with a roommate who was stressful to live with. In retrospect, I think that she was bipolar, and we didn't know that because one day she'd be a great roommate, lots of fun, really happy and positive. The next minute she was a shrew. And I think just dealing with that erratic kind of living situation wore on me. But when I moved out from that living situation, I would say my IBS or SIBO symptoms got maybe 40, 50% better in the course of like a week or two. No new supplements, no new dietary strategy, just getting away from a really stressful living situation. That was really huge. Yeah. And then similarly, when I graduated and I moved back in with my then fiance, now husband, that was a real load off of me stress-wise. And that was another big shift in my gut health journey. And now, like looking back, I think that stress was probably the most significant root cause that I had, but I wasn't super in tune with that at the time.
Yeah. The nervous system is so amazing. And I know you talk a lot about the vagus nerve and the nervous system on your channel and how that impacts digestion. Huge. And I think, our listeners are really excited to hear about kind of your SIBO journey and what things really helped you recover. It sounds like the nervous system is a big part of that, but maybe could you speak a little bit more on how you supported your nervous system or how you knew that was an issue and kind of what you did to address it?
Yeah, it's funny because now I have the perspective a good, 12, 13 years after the fact, and I could say more now than I realized at the time. So again, I didn't really treat the vagus nerve or appreciate the vagus nerve directly at the time. I think I just noticed the pattern of, oh, I moved out of the stressful living situation, and that made a big improvement. And then I moved back in with the love of my life, who we were in a long distance relationship for all those years. And I think that also caused a shift. So I just kind of observed that at the time, and I didn't connect all the dots. But now, knowing what I know about the importance of the vagus nerve and the gut-brain connection, it kind of makes sense that if I was in fight or flight mode, potentially for years, right? Like going through grad school and like clinical rotations and the whole kit and caboodle. But I think everything said and done, I was probably in some degree of fight or flight mode. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize it. I just kind of adapted to it and got accustomed to it. But I think that my vagus nerve was a little bit crispy at the time. And you could loosely extrapolate this to the conversation of adrenals. But you know what's funny is one of the things I talk about in my group coaching program when we get to the adrenal conversation is I think the testing is very limited. One reason is when I graduated, I can tell you now, I was very burnt out. I was very stressed. I was overwhelmed and daunted by the idea of going into clinical practice and not having a damn clue about business anything. And yet my adrenal testing looked fantastic. I went into it thinking, oh, I've got adrenal fatigue. I've got adrenal burnout. I'm going to have a flat line. And then my adrenal test came back looking pretty good. And I used that as an excuse to ignore the stress thing and not do the stress reduction strategies because I told myself, oh, I'm fine. Like I'm coping with this just fine. So I think that the topic of adrenal fatigue and how that folds into the mix is complicated in part because the testing for it just kind of stinks and isn't very reliable. But I think that was a big part of it for me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's so interesting. And, you know, one of the questions we got from one of my subscribers was about the SIBO testing and kind of the issues around that. Yeah. Could you speak a little bit about, you know, the challenges with the SIBO test and kind of your take on that?
I can, at the risk of being a bummer though.
Yeah, I know.
I fear that your viewers won't like me very much when I share this, but I've gotten to a point, it's a really weird place to be because I'm like the SIBO expert who does not order SIBO testing at all. I can't remember the last time I ordered a breath test. And I'm going to talk more about breath testing because I think that's what most people have. But I'm going to acknowledge that aspirate testing is far from perfect either. So there's a whole other sort of set of issues with aspirate testing. Namely, the big thing is that they have changed the cutoff of what they deem positive or negative for aspirate testing over the years. So we've lowered the bar really substantially with regards to aspirates, but that's kind of a different topic for another day. What I will share, and I have some videos about this on my channel, actually. I think I titled them all like false positives with lactulose, false positives with glucose, and false negatives with glucose. So those are the titles that you'll want to look for. But, you know, based on the data we have right now, where we're looking at not only doing breath testing, but following that sugar substrate down the intestines with a radioactive isotope and figuring out where it arrives in the colon and what the timing of that looks like. When they do that, when they follow the sugar substrate with a radioactive isotope and they do the breath test that way with imaging, 88% of the time, the first peak of gas production correlates with the arrival of the substrate in the colon. It is not happening in the small intestine. And that's for lactulose. Sorry if I didn't say that. So with lactulose specifically, 88% of the time, that peak that you're seeing is indicative of the substrate arriving in the colon, which means that it's perfectly normal and fine. And it yields an 88% false positive rate potentially with lactulose. Now, I would love to see more repeat studies confirming this with bigger and bigger cohorts, but from the data we have right now, that's what it appears to be. So lactulose, I think, is not only not useful, I think it's dangerous because now we get into a position where it's like, all right, well, 88% of people who do a lactulose test are going to get a false positive. That we are going to start prescribing antimicrobials and antibiotics and drugs and chasing the wrong goose. We're going to do that with so many people when we get a false positive on a lactulose test. Versus, I will say, in its defense, with glucose, it's more of like a pure 50-50 crapshoot which in my mind means it's no better than guessing, which means that I'm not going to waste my money on that one either. But at least I can kind of live with the 50-50 chance of a false positive with glucose as opposed to 88% possibly with lactulose. So again, knowing the flaws with both of them, I just don't do anymore. I figure if it looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, smells like a duck, quacks like a duck, I'm just going to treat it like a duck and call it a day. But I feel like I could get away with that because I'm really holistic and gentle, and I hardly ever do any antimicrobials. If I was the SIBO person who treated everybody with rifaximin and neomycin, I would be much more hesitant to just treat empirically without any sort of data.
Right. And so, that probably speaks to like your approach of root cause. So when you are treating someone with SIBO symptoms, are you looking more towards like motility? What's the next step when kind of someone like comes to you with those symptoms?
Yeah, I would say if we're hypothesizing that SIBO might be on the table, the two main things that I end up talking to people about end up being motility and dysbiosis. Because we also have some good data now that we can have dysbiosis in the small bowel, not the colon necessarily, although that happens too. But people with SIBO or people with SIBO symptoms or IBS symptoms usually have dysbiosis in the small bowel, and we really can't test for that shy of doing an aspirin. So we just have to kind of assume that it's there. Again, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, I'm assuming it's a duck. So I usually tackle it from both angles, the dysbiosis sort of angle and the dysmotility angle. And I think that they line up pretty well with the root causes that we know of for SIBO. So for example, looking at motility, we know that PPI use and things like hypothyroidism can cause dysmotility, which then can cause SIBO. Like that's pretty well established. Similarly, there's an awful lot of people out there, my podcast co-host Amy included, who swear up and down that their SIBO was triggered by antibiotic use, which I think builds the hypothesis that dysbiosis can play a big role too. So yeah, those are kind of the two halves of the SIBO coin in my mind.
Right. And I think our listeners would also be really interested. Like, we got a few questions about SIBO nutrition, and you can speak about this maybe in your own journey too, like what you tried with nutrition and how that went, and or with your patients, either one. But there's so much, misinformation about SIBO nutrition. So I'd love to hear your kind of thoughts on that.
Huge. Yeah, we could stay here for like a 3-hour dissertation on that topic alone. But I'll share briefly. What didn't work for me is continually just chopping out more foods out of my diet. It felt like that would work. And I did see some symptoms improve removing gluten and dairy. And I think when you feel some symptomatic improvement eliminating 1 or 2 foods, it is natural to think, if cutting out 2 was good, maybe cutting out 5 would be even better. Or maybe there's another boogeyman that I just don't know about. So I get how people arrive there. But I've joked for a long time. I did AIP before it was called AIP. I did AIP before it was cool. So Fodmap was brand new. The term Fodmap was coined in like 2010, basically when I had symptoms. So nobody knew what a Fodmap was. But we were starting to get a little bit closer to what I call the rise of paleo, which was like 2012 through 2014, where everybody started saying that grains are evil, lectins, et cetera, were evil. So we were getting kind of closer to that point. So I think I don't know if I found that out on the internet or in functional medicine seminars, but I did cut out all the grains, gluten, dairy, soy, corn, eggs, peanuts. I tried cutting out nightshades for a while. I think I cut out tree nuts for a while. And I was trying to find the boogeyman food.
Yeah.
And there was no boogeyman for me to find. It never ended up working out that way, despite several hundred, if not $1,000 worth of testing, trying to hunt for that, food sensitivity tests.
Yep.
So that's what I tried. What I will say, from a research standpoint is that we have 0.0 evidence that we can actually starve the SIBO. That is largely a myth. Now, the thing is, people are then going to say, well, I have symptoms when I eat a lot of the foods painted on your wall. So what the heck gives? We know that FODMAPs can draw water into the bowel and that can cause some distension and bloating, in that if you have visceral hypersensitivity, if the nerve endings and the gut-brain axis are hyper responsive to stimuli, that little bit of bloating or distension or stretch can be very painful for people with IBS, but it's not necessarily because we're feeding the SIBO. There's actually a handful of studies now that show that people with IBS, which, like, I'm going to use them semi-interchangeably because we know the data between the two, right? So I'm acknowledging they're different, but also I'm acknowledging they're very similar.
There's a lot of overlap. Yeah.
There is. And frankly, I think a lot of people who are told that they have SIBO, because again, false positive rates with breath testing, I think a lot of those people have IBS and not actual SIBO. So I kind of mishmash them together when I talk. That might annoy some people, but I think it's the most truthful thing to do. But my point is, in somebody who has that nervous system that's primed and hyper responsive to stimuli, and then you get a normal consequence of eating a Fodmap, like a little bit more water drawn into the bowel, some expansion, some distension, that normal stimuli is now very, very painful and can elicit the symptoms that we know, like the cramping and the bloating and the pain. And now you're off to the races. And now you've got IBS and symptoms, and then you get anxious because you have the symptoms, and then that makes you more hypervigilant and fries your nervous system even more, and it really entrenches you further into it the longer you go. I'm sorry, I think I forgot the question though. I went on a tangent and then I brain farted on what I was supposed to be saying.
This is also important.
Food.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so we know why Fodmaps elicit these symptoms in people with IBS and maybe SIBO, but it's not necessarily because we're feeding the SIBO. And we also have no evidence that starving the SIBO works. Actually, we have some evidence, like, the study everybody cites where they gave one group rifaximin and another group got rifaximin and PHGG, and the people who took PHGG had a better kill rate on their SIBO. We have little articles like that suggest that feeding the SIBO and keeping prebiotics in your diet actually might be the more effective option for treating your SIBO. So anyway, sorry, I kind of interrupted you, but I had my brain fart and then I had my epiphany of what I was supposed to be talking about.
Yeah.
I just got excited.
I get this question all the time, from my clients with SIBO is like, should I be eating FODMAPs? Are FODMAPs feeding the SIBO? And it's hard because there's so many diets out there, like the fast track diet and all these diets that they seem really evidence-based, but we have to remember that one study doesn't mean that it's evidence-based. Like if there's one good study, it doesn't mean that it's like the gold standard. And so I think it's really important for people to, one, know that that's not a real thing, that you have to starve your SIBO. And in fact, it'll probably make you more constipated. And that's, you need to be having normal bowel movements to really overcome SIBO. And then secondly, what you said about how FODMAPs work. Our intestines are sensitive, and the nervous system is playing a really big role in FODMAP sensitivity. So anyway, I just thought those were two really important things that you said. Yeah.
Well, and going back to the idea that there's two sides to the SIBO coin, right? Motility and dysbiosis. Well, if we're hypothesizing dysbiosis is involved, the worst thing you could do, the number one worst thing you could do for dysbiosis is antimicrobials or antibiotics, which are horrendously overused in the SIBO community, but also restricted dieting and limiting dietary fiber and dietary diversity. That's like the kiss of death for dysbiosis. So we have this condition, which is inherently a condition of dysbiosis, so it seems. And then we're taking away all of these amazing prebiotics and people's sanity in the process, because doing this diet for a prolonged period of time is really, really difficult and draining. It's not a good situation at the end of the day. I think that the question of should I as an individual do low FODMAP, I think if you did low FODMAP with a dietitian like you, who's trained and knows what to do, and kind of how to challenge it and work things back in, it could be worth trying as a symptomatic Band-Aid, but just know that it's a symptomatic Band-Aid and it's not necessarily treating the root of what you're dealing with. And it might be making some of the roots worse if you use it for too long. So in my mind, if you stick with, the Monash sort of outline, if you did the elimination diet as appropriate for the individual for like 4 to 6 weeks, You judge if it was effective for you. If it wasn't effective, you abandoned the diet. If it was effective, then you could start challenging different columns and different foods. I think that makes all the sense in the world, and it can help you feel better in the short term, but you've really got to start working on the motility and the gut-brain axis and the dysbiosis and the other stuff.
Right.
You can't get stuck on low FODMAP for months or years of your life. That's just not going to do you any good.
Right. And I think, just to be clear, for those listening, it's not that we're against and using antibiotics or using antimicrobials at all. It's just there has to be that plan in place, right? Like, because I see a lot of people who have taken a lot of rounds of rifaximin, and I'm definitely not against antimicrobials or antibiotics, but we have to then have a plan to repopulate.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, the best way I could articulate this is when I have students go through my program, it's 12 weeks, 13 modules of stuff that they learn with me. The very last thing we talk about is antimicrobials. So in my mind, I tell my students all the time, modules 0 through 11, my goal is to build you a SIBO-proof body, and a body that can actually digest your food and do the motility thing and has a good gut-brain axis. Then if you get to week 12 and you feel like you could still use that little bit of oomph from killing off the bad boogeymen, be my guest. But I tell people, by the time you get to that, 90% of you won't need that material anyway. That's kind of like a whatever module for a lot of you. And even if you do, instead of doing this giant honking protocol where it's like 3 different antimicrobials and a biofilm disruptor, it's like, oh, maybe I'll take a bit of oregano. And it's a much more casual, less intense sort of a thing by the time you get there, because you prepared your body, you prepared your microbiome, you're nutritionally replete, you're able to handle that. And so doing antimicrobials when you're ready for it and your body is strong and built up and resilient, that's totally different from what most people are doing, which is they have a body that's really depleted and frankly not in a good place, and they're not able to tolerate a lot of stuff, and then they're just hammering the snot out of it with antimicrobials left and right. Mm-hmm. Those are 2 different uses of antimicrobials.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This was so helpful. And we answered a lot of the questions actually just throughout our conversation naturally, Perfect. Which is always how it goes with us. I love chatting with you because your approach is just so holistic and really comprehensive and viewing the person as a whole person. Yeah. If people want to learn more about you and what you do, where can people connect with you?
Yeah. So as you said, I am the self-appointed microbiome queen. So you could find me on YouTube. My channel is just called Dr. DiNezza Gut Microbiome Queen. And on Instagram, I'm Gut Microbiome Queen, but the handle is gut.microbiome.queen. I am also one half of the IBS Freedom podcast. So Amy Hollenkamp and I host that. And we have a YouTube channel for that podcast. And we also have it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, et cetera. So wherever podcasts are found, you will find us probably. And then I think those are probably most of my haunts on the internet. My number 1 and number 2 tend to be YouTube and the podcast. And then I go on Instagram when I have the wherewithal to do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Nikki. It was great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Molly.
Talk to you soon.
Bye.